Hello, and welcome to Kierkegaard Night in Canada. Joining me today are some of Canada's favorite Kierkegaardians, Carolyn Mackey, Dr. Stephen Backhouse, and Reverend Dr. Myron Penner. I'm Reverend Heather Liddell, educational chaplain at the University of Alberta and the rector of St. Peter's Anglican Church here in Edmonton. Carolyn Mackey holds an MA in philosophy from the Institute of Christian Studies and is now a PhD candidate at the Toronto School of Theology. She's a regular contributor to the Women in Theology blog, a poet, and an advocate for survivors of sexual misconduct within the church. Dr. Stephen Backhouse hosts a popular podcast, Tent Talks. He is the author of several books and articles, including Kierkegaard's Critique of Christian Nationalism and the award-winning biography Kierkegaard, A Single Life. He's originally from Canada, but he now lives and works in the UK as a political theologian and a consultant. The Reverend Dr. Myron Penner is the rector of the Anglican Parish of St. Paul here in Edmonton. He is the author of the award-winning book, The End of Apologetics, Christian Witness in a Postmodern Context. He is also the proud owner of a dog who attends philosophy classes, and his name is Odin.
True story.
Many, many years ago, he was my boss. Today, we will be exploring the ways that Soren Kierkegaard connects to and informs our lives of faith and social responsibility in an explicitly Canadian context, addressing the question of whether or not we have a Canadian identity. And these three are going to get so tired of my pronunciation of Kierkegaard. I remember a few years ago now, walking back after the final dinner of a fellowship in Krakow, Poland, with one of the leaders who'd grown up in Denmark. And I quoted Kierkegaard badly, saying something like, "It is an act of love to presume love in another." And he sort of stopped in the middle of the street in this dark, gorgeous, old city and says, "You would teach me of Kierkegaard?"
That's awesome.
You three are an excellent company in your chagrin at my pronunciation, and I'm so sorry.
No apologies necessary.
Let's get started. Myron, how did you first get interested in Kierkegaard?
Wow, that takes me way back. And I think Steve and I talked with you a little bit about this way back when we did our little talk with the podcast there. But really, it came out of a existential wrestling with myself and faith and who I was and what it meant and all of that stuff. And to be honest, I was trying to figure out what this Christianity thing really meant, and was very aware that it could mean a lot of different things. And didn't know if some of them were definitely harmful and not good things, and some of them were things I needed to explore. And so I initially got very fascinated with the whole, my questions were those that are typically addressed by Christian apologetics, the defense of the faith. And so I started, as I started poking around and asking questions, poking around in my dad's library, I was being directed towards these apologetic books and that whole approach, right? So people like Francis Schaeffer and some good ones like C.S. Lewis, Mere Christianity, was really helpful. But you get into some of these answers and they just seem a little too quick, a little too glib. And then this name Kierkegaard kept popping up for me. And I remember reading him in people like Norm Geisler, who some of you might recognize, and Francis Schaeffer, and they would be describing Kierkegaard's views, and I'd be going, "Oh yeah," and then they would say, "Oh, and he's completely wrong for all these reasons," and I'd be going, "Oh man, yeah, well, I don't know what to say to that." And then one day, of all the people, I read a little book by C. Stephen Evans, which I still think is a really good entry point for people to start to understand both Kierkegaard and the whole existentialism movement in the late 20th century. But he wrote a little book called Existentialism: the Philosophy of Despair and the Quest for Hope. And I read that book and I got a completely different picture of Kierkegaard. And I really felt, what that book did is it enabled me to identify what this driving restlessness was inside of me, that it wasn't an intellectual question in the first sense. And so, I can still remember the moment I kind of became a Kierkegaardian. I went to university. I took a course called existentialism and phenomenology, and there was a brilliant lecture by my very atheistic prof on Kierkegaard's transition to faith and the role that it plays in his existence spheres. And I just was blown away by it. So I cornered him after class. I had all these questions and he was answering them. It was really good. And then I just looked at him and I said, Dr. Preuss, like, why aren't you a Christian? Because like it just was like laying out for me this approach to faith that I just thought made real sense. And he just looked at me and he said, because I don't want to. And that's all he had to say, because we had some great arguments about a whole bunch of stuff. And his only response was, no, I'm not going to. He had no comeback other than
that has persisted for me. So as I'm working on my dissertation, I am talking a fair bit about the idea of a self. And I think what I find so fascinating from Kierkegaard is that it's a very, like he's responding to this question that is really important that's coming up in modernity, almost like a crisis of this idea of like, what does it mean to be a self? And he's kind of giving this fresh, like what I think is a very fresh philosophical answer that's like very uniquely Christian. And that it's both, like the self is both given by God, so it's something that's given, but it's also something that is like formed by the choices we make, like ethical choices. So I feel he's really got both of those going on at the same time, that it's both received as a gift and it's also a task for us. And also I really like how he, I think something that really spoke to me just like on a kind of gut level as I was thinking through these questions of selfhood is how he formulates the self as kind of suspended between these poles of like the eternal and temporal, freedom and necessity. So he's got these like, it's almost these contradictions that we're constantly finding ourselves in. And I found that really helpful because I always felt like this sort of angst and like conflicted sense. And reading him, it's like, oh, that's normal that I would feel that because we are eternal and we're in time. So of course, there's this kind of constant sense of contradiction. And then his idea of the self, I think, is also like that idea of a self that is formed by contradiction is drawn from Christ. So it's this really interesting way of modeling the human person after Christ, which is a really long Christian tradition of doing that. But it's in this kind of like Christ is the ultimate contradiction of the God man, and time and eternity brought together. And so that is something that we like, wrestling with his contradictions is something that is actually part of following Christ, which I find really cool.
Thank you so much. There's so much in what you just said that is so relatable about being a young person and trying to figure out who you are and feeling that pull between, as you said, being eternal and being in a temporal existence. Being young is hard. Stephen, how did you?
It's hard now. I want to ask Carolyn now. How do I figure out who I am in the middle of my whole world is falling apart over the last 5-6 years? And who am I now? And living in the tension. I think all that stuff is exactly what we need to hear right now. And I'm not young.
I thought we were all young. Maybe. Maybe
I passed my young days a long time ago. My young days were in the same town, little town that Myron grew up in, and the same little town that Carolyn went to her undergraduate or her Bible college days in. So I grew up in Three Hills, Alberta. Let's incarnate it. Let's name it. I grew up 3 hours south of Edmonton. I grew up in Three Hills, Alberta. And I grew up born again. I grew up in an evangelical world amongst a lot of self-confessed fundamentalists. That wasn't a label that was put on them by their enemies. That was something that a lot of people in my area actually claimed they were they were proud to be fundamentalists. And but I also grew up along with conservative evangelicalism comes, of course, a lot of kind of culture warrior mindset. So Myron talked about the apologetics and the idea that, you gotta argue your case, you gotta win the battles, you gotta convince people, you gotta change the culture, so I grew up with a lot of that. At school, I had Liberty University textbooks. I think we were using in school, and Rapture was taught in school, and 6-day creationism was taught in school, and lots of patriotism and culture war, nationalism. There's a lot of stuff that was being taught, and it wasn't all coming straight from Three Hills. So a lot of it was being imported from America. Because when you grow up evangelical in Canada, you're basically an American, aren't you? So because all of our textbooks were, all our books that we read were coming out of American scene. All of the music, the subculture, Christian evangelical culture music we were listening to was coming out of America. The movies and stuff that we'd watch, all of that stuff, The Thief in the Night and This Present Darkness and the Left Behind and all that stuff was American, right? And so I was really strongly associating Christianity with a certain type of conservative patriotic culture, basically. And then when I was 19, I moved to England, and I was just for an adventure. My dad is English. My dad actually taught Myron once in college. My dad is English, and I'd always wanted to live in England, see what that was like. So when I was 19, I left Three Hills and I moved to England for a while. And I had a culture shock, right? Because the Christians that I met, that I was with, they didn't associate being Christian with whatever right-wing cause you want to name. They didn't associate it with gun owning or anti-abortion or denying climate change or whatever tick box, not liking gay people, whatever the cause was that Christians were supposed to line up under. I found I was with a group of people who were Christian but didn't tick all those boxes. And it was a little bit of a existential crisis I had, which I didn't even know that word, right? And I was working in a bookshop as well to pay my way through as I traveled around England. And I was using my employee discount to educate myself. And I was buying books with my employee discount that were the kind of serious books that everyone should read, but probably never does. So I discovered Tolstoy and Dostoevsky and Kafka. But I also picked off the shelf was Kierkegaard, the book called Fear and Trembling. So I remember being a 19, 20-year-old living in my little bedsit flat in England, reading fear and trembling, and it was like vertigo. It was like the world dropped out under me when I read this. I've never, very rarely experienced something like that. And here was Soren Kierkegaard was explaining. He died in 1850 or whatever it was, and he died in Denmark, and he never lived really outside of Denmark, and yet he was describing North American evangelicalism to me. And he was describing what it's like when a culture confuses its citizenship and its patriotism with its faith, when it thinks that being a Christian is the same as being born into a certain culture. And he blew that away, and he started to give me language to describe the unease I was feeling. That I realized, oh yeah, the people I left, that was not the full definition of being a Christian. And in fact, all of those check boxes, a lot of them are very anti-Christian, actually. And a lot of the most sort of fervent beliefs, especially around violence and war and nationalism, and then blowing your enemies away with your own private handguns and all that. A lot of that kind of rights-based Christianity of like aggrieved, our rights are infringed and we're aggrieved and we need to defend what's rightfully ours to the death, and we need to destroy our enemies intellectually or physically. That was the thing that I realized, not only was it not Christian, it was an organized anti-Christ. And Kierkegaard starts to describe Christendom as an organized attempt to defend yourself from Jesus. And that really meant something to me. So that's how I discovered Kierkegaard. And I ended up becoming, when I went to university in England, I studied I took any option I could to study Kierkegaard. I then did my master's. I went back to Montreal, actually. I came back to Canada for a couple of years and did my master's at McGill in Kierkegaard. And then I came back to England and I got my doctorate on Kierkegaard's critique of Christian nationalism. So there you are. So, and that's why I have this weird accent, because I am Canadian, but I've lived in England now for so many decades that my accent has drifted. I do apologize for my drifting accent.
Oh, we'll still keep you. I do have to tell you that Carolyn and I met working at a bookstore in Toronto when we were getting our master's. Is there.
Those are magical places, those bookstores. We got to keep them. We got to treat them precious.
Oh, we do. But before I go on a full rant about ownership of warehouses.
Yes.
What would Kierkegaard have to tell us today about being a Canadian? Because an organized attempt to defend yourself from Jesus, I don't want to tell you where to go with anything, but I want to hear more about that.
Well, I mean, look, let's name the names, right? I mean, we're living in a Trumpy land. We're living in a Trumpy world. We're living in a world where Christians are utterly drunk on nationalism. And that is moving everywhere, very much including Canada. We know that truly. But the Trumpy he was a catalyst for something that was existing for a long time already. He didn't invent it, but he kind of helped spark something. And I think that we have a bunch of Christians who, we're looking at the convoy type people, we're looking at the real kind of nationalist type people. They kind of, let's make Canada Christian again. Let's defend our Christian heritage. And by Christian, of course, they actually just mean white. I think that it's really not hard to see. Like it doesn't take any effort at all to notice the overt nationalism in a lot of this. It's Christian heritage language that is actually just very much about preserving some sort of ethnic heritage, some sort of civilizational dream. And those things have nothing to do with following the way of Jesus. And so Soren Kierkegaard would look at any form of nationalism, Denmark or America or England or Canada, and he would say, you're just defending some kind of inherited forms of life that have nothing to do with following the way of Jesus. And in fact, the way of Jesus will almost certainly put you at odds with the very things that you are most enthusiastically defending. The way of Jesus will put you at odds with those things. And if you continue to persist in following those things and continue to call yourself Christian while doing it, you've now added the crime of blasphemy on top of all your other crimes. So that's where he would be. And he ended his life with this thing called the attack on Christendom, which was for very Christ-centered reasons. He utterly wanted to dismantle official Christian culture and civilization. So,
Myron, I can see that you're talking, but I am 100% sure you're muted.
Okay. Yeah. Sorry, I did turn that off, and I'm back on. Yeah, and I totally resonate with what Stephen is saying. But for me, the way I didn't come at the question overtly through the nationalism question. What was utterly significant to me was this concept of what he called the essentially Christian, and I think that is what really is at the core of what Stephen's talking about, because Kierkegaard is quite sure that the essentially Christian can't be inherited, it can't be socialized, you can't be socialized into it from an external form. It's really about, in ways that I could understand because of my evangelical heritage, which was exactly the same as Stephen's, that it's about meeting Jesus and being undone by Jesus. And the problem that I kept running into in my own faith community is that everybody just seemed far too sure that they actually just needed Jesus to get over to get over the line. They could get all the way there. They just need him for the last little bit because he endorsed everything else that they said, as opposed to the Jesus that Kierkegaard tells me, which places me and everything about me radically in question. And does that in order so that I can actually have myself in ways that I think I heard Carolyn saying as well. And so then for me, that became my ability to, I guess, to use a Kierkegaardian term, relate dialectically to my own community. And then from there start to move out and recognize the kinds of things that did I call you Stephen or David? Because your dad has pointed out that I sometimes call you by your brother's name for good reason, because he was my office assistant at Prairie.
There's the webs of connections here.
I'm so sorry, Stephen.
There's a whole works of love connections between me and
in ways that Stephen was talking about. Oh my gosh.
No, I think you called me Stephen. That's fine.
Okay.
So Myron,
I think I almost just call you David.
I kind of felt like I had to sort of leave my evangelicalism behind in order to kind of find authenticity. But it sounds like you're talking a little bit more like you were bringing the world you grew up in to the conversation. Like you didn't see it as a rejection and an embrace. You saw it as a dialectical.
Well, I think for me, I had encountered something within the community that I couldn't, for lack of a better term, and I actually hate the term used this way, that I couldn't deconstruct. So it was really clear to me that these people over here, if that's what Christianity is, I couldn't care even if it's the truth. I don't want it because it's awful, right? Whereas there's these other people whom I encountered that really it wasn't that, and there was something different. And it seemed to have everything to do with this person called Jesus, who they allowed to put them under critique, right? And so, and I think I can't invalidate the experience that I had with Christ, and so that there seemed to be something there. I just couldn't figure out what it was.
Yeah.
So the forms, I guess the solutions to the dilemma that involved just throwing the baby out with the bathwater did not seem at all plausible either. So I was kind of stuck. And for me, Kierkegaard is the guy who kind of unstuck me and gave me the ability to relate dialectically, which always kept putting me on the margins of my community, but still, it gave me the ability to sort of inhabit that marginal space. And I think that whole question of margins, because one of the things that, of course, that happens when you grow up in a community like ours, Stephen, in Canada, is that you are marginalized fundamentally, right? Like I grew up being a weirdo, right? We were the weirdos.
Right.
And then you sort of double down on that and embrace your weirdness, right? But there was this, it gave me the ability to then understand how to reconnect myself, not just to the identity that I had in Christ, but also to Canadian identity.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I've got a question, and I definitely want to hear Caro's take on this as well. Like,
Yeah.
are we all in agreement that Kierkegaard would sort of say that we don't have a Canadian identity, but we have social responsibilities as part of a life of faith? Like, is that something that we're kind of saying when we try and say, what would Kierkegaard say about what we are as Canadians, or what are Canadians?
I really want to hear Carolyn with her identity.
I do too, yeah.
I mean, I guess a question I'm thinking of too is, like, it's hard to kind of think how to translate Kierkegaard's Christendom into Canada, because I feel like Canada's sort of post-Christendom. Like, I hear what you're saying, Myron, like growing up in the Three Hills context, it's a very like fundamentalist, and you do have that import from America. So that's kind of a question I'm thinking through as we talk about this. Like, how does that translate into the Canadian context?
But do you think that there is such a thing as, do Christians have a national identity at all?
Should they, or do they? I think that.
Well, do they fundamentally?
Yeah, that's a very.
Although they say they do, to be authentically Christian, is that to not have a national identity anymore?
I mean, that's a really good question, because like, we're also in time. We're also like Kierkegaard also talks about how, it's not just like endless possibility. We're also limited, we're finite, we're bound by necessity in certain ways. And the place we grow up in, that kind of aspect to our identity, is something that you can't just completely divest yourself of.
Yeah, right.
But then how much is that actually part of how you understand yourself as a person, I guess?
I mean,
for me, can I jump in here for a second?
Yeah, right.
The very first thing that I read of Kierkegaard in that class I was telling you about was an abridged version of Either Or. And here's where this whole identity piece started to fall in for me. And at first I couldn't understand what he meant, but I really wanted to. And I spent a long time trying to work it out. But Judge Williams says to the aesthete, he talks about repenting yourself out of your facticity, out of your nation, your family, so the ethical moves, but to then in the next breath to repent yourself back into it. But of course, that is really a species of what Hegel would call Aufhebung, right? Where now what happens when you repent yourself back into your facticity, your nation, your job, your whatever it is, now you're no longer there as you were before, because you're there as one who has been outside of it, right? And so what it did for me, and I think I definitely think that it's the only way for you to have a national identity as a Christian is to have one that is aufheben, that one that is caught up and recontextualized in a wider context, that is Jesus Christ, so that it can only be something that you adopt insofar as it is the particular way in which you are being the one who is in Christ. Because you can't be a Christian, as I think Carolyn was saying, in the abstract. Like, you have to be in a concrete place doing concrete things, but you can't be defined by them as the things that determine what your projects really are. And so that's what I was trying to get at when I talked about finding a way for me to be a Christian and to be a Canadian at the same time. And what that means, I think, at least for me, is that, being a Christian Canadian means that I'll have to inhabit the world fundamentally differently than if I was an American, a Christian American. And I deliberately put it in that order, like a Christian Canadian and a Christian American, because, and Kierkegaard, if he's anything, is a contextual thinker. He's a polemical thinker. He thinks to the occasion. He thinks to his particular place and time, and he's overt about that. And so what the times require are different depending on the times and the context. And so there is a whole different set of things that one has to, I guess, defend oneself against oneself for in the Canadian context than you do in the American context. That's how I look at it. I kind of went off there. Sorry.
Can I ask Heather? Can I ask Carolyn a question?
Yeah.
Because I'm interested in this idea of tension. Like, so okay, fine. Yes, I agree. He's contextual, and he's incarnational, and all those things. But clearly, Carolyn, you felt that something that Kierkegaard was writing to Danish people in the 1840s was relevant to you. So, and you talked about this tension. So I'm feeling in the last 5 or 6 years just this almost unbearable tension between things that I thought were good or thought to be true or were told were good or told to be true and then revealed themselves to not actually be true or good. Lots of family members, not my family, not my immediate family members, but like people I know kind of losing their tiny minds to conspiracy theories. You know, like the idea that we're kind of living, just being pulled apart. It almost feels like tension has disappeared because it's just being pulled apart. It doesn't even almost feel like we're living on tension anymore. How do you find Kierkegaard as a resource for living in these kind of times when they're like nothing seems true anymore or solid anymore?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's what resonated so much for me, like as a younger person, was just this sense. I mean, it's sort of that existentialist bent that he has, but it's also like Kierkegaard talks a lot about passion, and I feel it like for him, it's almost like those tensions fuel the passion. Okay. And, you know, even looking to Christ, it's not a simple, straightforward thing. You can't look at Christ and know that he's the Son of God. You have to believe that he's the Son of God because he doesn't look like you would think the Son of God looks.
Yeah.
And so that's what gives faith its passion, is that it is fueled by this tension of uncertainty and not being able to prove anything or even prove to yourself in a way.
It's a matter of the will, not the intellect, like the heart, not the intellect.
Yeah.
Right? Well, like Myron's professor, who's just said, I don't want to be a Christian. It's not that it's not intellectually compelling to me. I don't want it.
I refuse it.
Yeah. And that's a very honest position to be in. So this idea that like in this world of tension, the passion is important, right? Like, is this what you're saying, Carolyn? That like,
I think so. And I guess it often feels like we're kind of told, maybe by culture or whatever, that if you're feeling these sort of inner tensions, or if you aren't certain about something, that's a bad thing. It's maybe a problem with you haven't figured it out. And I feel like with Kierkegaard, it's like, no, this is exactly where you're supposed to be in the life of faith.
I really connected with what you were saying there around that, Carolyn, because I think that's exactly what I felt. Exactly. Like I felt he was explaining me to me. And that sense of, I mean, as I think all of us probably know, like you're supposed to be so certain. And that's why I could never be one of the card-carrying members, and you know, as a young person of whatever club I was supposed to be part of, because I just couldn't be certain. Like there was I had too much angst. I could see too many other possibilities, right? And then to hear that this is how you're made, and that faith isn't about that. The opposite of faith, Anticlimacus, to be fair, says isn't doubt, it's despair.
Yeah.
And so that to me is the framework that addresses the issues that you're talking about, David. And that kind of connects to what we were talking about with
Stephen.
David. Wow. But what we were talking about with Amber and hope, right? It kind of connects to that same thing in Kierkegaard about
hope. Like, where is hope come in and all this? Is hope and faith, are those different things? Is hope different than faith, or are they synonymous terms?
Who are you asking, or who are you
I'm
talking
just throwing it out there.
You're throwing it out there
to the world.
What do you
At
think,
the very
Carolyn?
least, they're best friends.
I mean, Kierkegaard also says hope is possibility, and like he talks about the person who's fainting, and he's just like gasping for air, and he's like, possibility, get him possibility. That's what he needs.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I kind of love that about him too. It's like this, like hope is also that I can act as a person. I have agency. It's not like the future isn't determined by the past or by this sort of sense of necessity. Like we're like, as humans, God has given us this incredible agency to use going forward, although it's also limited by certain necessities.
But faith is precisely the context in which hope can breathe, right? And
yeah.
I love how he also says that God is that all things are possible, and God doesn't think he creates.
So what? I haven't lived in Canada for a while. What seems hopeless in Canada right now?
Oh, everything.
Yeah. Go on, Heather. You're the chaplain and pastor to the youth of today.
And there's hope because there's Christ, because there's God. There's hope because this is not the end, but things are tough. We're having a national identity crisis.
Okay.
So that was
I think to be a Canadian, let's be fair. To be a Canadian is to have a perpetual identity crisis. Let's just be honest about that.
Looking for that's perfect.
But Carolyn would say that's good. That's the tension. That produces the passion.
I mean, I actually think that it has been a strength of Canadian culture, but I feel like that people are wanting that certainty now, and especially like last Canada Day with all the residential school graves that had just been uncovered. So many of us were saying, no, we're not going to celebrate this day. We're not going to this Canadian identity is enmeshed with colonialism and with a very dark history, and we can't celebrate that. And now, driving around in the light of the Freedom Convoy, I'm seeing Canadian flags on people's lawns, and I'm just the contrast between July and February with how people were responding to the flag was really disturbing to me. That so soon after we'd been mourning, this colonial identity that we have, people were sort of rushing to display these flags in the name of freedom. I find that really disturbing.
It's like a retreat away towards some kind of simplistic certainty.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, yeah, and I would like to say these flags that they were waving and displaying in the name of a concept that they liked to call freedom, because because it's far from clear to me that it was anything like real freedom.
I mean, I'm aware that there's no problem facing any country which is improved by ramping up patriotism. There's no problem that is made better by adding more patriotism.
Yeah, and I like,
by definition, it kind of demands that you sort of shut down your options and you stop thinking about the wider solutions and you stop thinking about complex things, and it's almost by definition it's going to make your problems worse.
Yeah,
because you're cutting yourself off from potential solutions or new ways of thinking, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
It seems like such a betrayal too. I'm just speaking for the Anglican Church of Canada, but we're a church that in '93 our primate came out with a statement of apology about the residential schools, which was 3 years before the last residential school closed in Canada. Our church has been a church of reconciliation and repentance, and trying in faltering steps to look at the reality of the situation and to be held accountable to it, and to figure out what it means to be Christians, and to be Christians that come out of the Church of England and come out of a colonial, we wouldn't be here without colonialism. And yet there is something that we have to say that matters, and that is an important part of living a life of faith in this context. And yet we sometimes make decisions that really betray that and make us not look like a church that repents and not look like a church that really cares about getting it right and being held accountable when we do not get it right. And I don't know what to do with that. But that thing Carolyn said earlier about that tension is exactly where you need to be. I kind of got a deep breath and I felt some tension leave my body, because I was like, yeah, that is where we need to be, is in that tension, in as tempting as it is to try and find simple answers. They're just not there.
Yeah.
Well, I think a lot of, go on, man. I have a thing to say about institutions, but
okay, yeah, and I was just going to say, I think one of the things that we have to keep clear is that you can always fall off the horse on two sides, right? And so we like our antagonisms, and we like to define our world by our antagonisms because they simplify. And I think maybe that's what I took from Carolyn, right? And those antagonisms, it doesn't matter what side of the horse they're falling off on, the left or the right. It's this, I love what Gillian Rose, at least what comes out of her thought and her whole bit on Holocaust piety. We won't get into Gillian Rose because this is a Kierkegaard thing, but she's a really profoundly affected by Kierkegaard and a good interpreter of him in some particular ways. But she talks about Holocaust piety, and she herself is a Jew, but how we like to worship. Well, yeah, we like to almost valorize the Holocaust victims and as this unnameable evil. And she says, when we do that, we cannot engage it anymore. But what we often do then is we just cut off the other side as the unnameable evil. And instead of entering into a solidarity as those who are broken, shattered, however you want to say that, those who are not themselves innocent, and coming in and into a situation and saying, I want to hear you. I want to listen to you. We just close off dialogue. And this is the part of Kierkegaard, I think, that is deeply Hegelian. He wants the dialectic to continue. He never wants to shut it down. He never wants to say, here's the rule. This is the line. If you stay on this side of the line, you're okay. If you don't, he just refuses to draw those lines and says, let's engage. Love believes all things, yet is never deceived, right? Sorry, Stephen, go ahead.
Well, no, it's kind of related to what actually everyone is saying, but when Heather was talking about the Anglican Church in Canada as well, it's that one of the things I get from Kierkegaard is just his awareness. He wants to humanize things that have become inhuman. So he often will talk about Christendom, but he'll often talk about institutions as well, or he'll talk about mobs or groups, or he's
the crowd.
Really concerned with like human groups that have grown inhuman, and that like I mentioned earlier when I said Christendom is like an organized attempt to defend yourself against Jesus. Yeah. Well, a lot of institutions are kind of our organized way of not having to live as like individuals with kind of face to face with other people. We kind of hide in our institutions. We let them do the work for us. And there's something that Kierkegaard is like always suspicious really of any group that kind of says, well, we've done this, we've made the decision, we don't have to think about this anymore, let's just let the institutions do it for us. And he always brings you back to like, no, you're hiding in your institutions and you've grown inhuman. We need to put a face back on it again. And that to me is something could be very useful for Canadians feeling like uncertain and then feeling like they're going to retreat back into institutions in order to protect themselves. Well, that comes at the cost of your own humanity.
Yes. And this is, if I can speak, this is, I think, Kierkegaard's profound difference from Marx. But we don't need to get into that if you don't want. While he shares an awful lot with Marx, Nietzsche, and Freud, this would be a big difference from Marx. Marx would want to tear down the institutions, but build new ones. Kierkegaard doesn't want to build any new ones. He thinks the problems are the institutional, the deification of the established order. Right. And he refuses to deify the established order, no matter what order it is, even if it puts a cross at the front of the church.
So we live with them, but we have to not let these institutions become our gods.
Yeah.
Heather,
Yep.
wearing your collar. Myron, wearing your collar.
Yeah, I didn't have my collar on
Carolyn,
today.
attending your university. Be careful of your institutions.
Yeah.
You should all become like me. Live in a shed by yourself.
He has lots to say about the monks too, so
I know. He never lets any of us.
Never lets anyone off. Yeah.
Nor should he. And I think that that is a perfectly appropriate place for us to call it for today, because I don't know that we're going to get any clear answers. And if we did, I think we'd be deeply suspicious of them.
Correct.
Thank you so much for joining together today to have this conversation. I know I feel fired up by it, and I hope you do too. And I hope so do our listeners.
Awesome. It's been great to see each one of you.
Yeah,
It's lovely
thank
to
you.
see you all again. Thanks, Heather.
Cheers.